Afternoon, everyone. It is 3 o'clock, and here we are one more time. I feel like a radio person when this starts, or maybe like a television person. I am very happy to see people here. People will keep coming, I hope. It usually works that way. I delay some presentations in the beginning. I speak about a few things so that people have a chance to join us. Um, so before anything, I am Rogerio Pinto. I am a professor here at the School of Social Work at the University of Michigan. And I have the pleasure to be doing this for 11 weeks in the fabulous company of the co-chair of the Faculty Alliance for Diversity, Eddie Weaver, who you can see who's just waving at us. And also my other colleagues who are members of the Faculty Alliance for Diversity, Todd Horencall, David Cordova, Trina Shanks, Lorraine Gutierrez, and we are all joined by Larry Gant, who is the director of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program in our school. Before I introduce the subject of today and we move on talking about the many things that we are going to be addressing today, I just wanted to remind us that 11 weeks ago, when we started this, we had no idea that we would be here talking about COVID-19, right? I mean, there was hope that maybe this thing was going to go away, and it didn't. There was hope that it might be a little different than what it turned out to be. But it looks like on a daily basis, it's not getting much better, right? I mean, one sees something is getting better here, but other things not so good in other places. I'm someone who was born in Brazil, who came to the United States, so my family is still in Brazil. And I don't know if you have heard the numbers in Brazil are getting higher and higher to the point where it is Brazil today is the third country in terms of the number of deaths and the number of people. Well, I don't want to talk about people who are positive for the virus because testing is so completely crazy everywhere, including the United States. So that's very hard to compare. But we can compare how many people are dying in each of the countries, right, where this thing is ravishing communities, particularly communities of color. So I think that I start today reminding us that this is a global thing, right? I mean, it's global and it's very local. For the past several weeks, we discussed very local issues related to Detroit, New York City, New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and Newark, New Jersey. And each time that we have those conversations, we get out of this 1 hour discussion knowing more about the local, how communities across the United States have been affected by COVID-19 and how specific groups within those communities have been affected by COVID-19. But it is so egregious what's been going on with some groups in our society that it deserves an entire hour to just talk about them, which is what we are going to be doing today. People that I conceptualize, no matter if they are immigrants, if they are refugees, if they are Americans in jail, people who are de facto, probably between four walls, by themselves in isolation or with a lot of people around them and without a lot of the resources that we have as we are having this conversation. And many people who are themselves at risk for contracting the disease and of course dying from the disease. So, so this is what we are going to be addressing today. Populations that are affected by COVID-19, but who are not in a position to do very much about it because they depend on other people who are controlling them, controlling their spaces, controlling their movements. They are dependent, perhaps even more than the people we talked about last week with children and young people. But they still have some control over their lives compared to people who are imprisoned, right? So I really want us to keep that in mind, that we are talking about individuals and communities who find themselves in a situation where there's very little that they believe they can do about it because they are under control of governments and police states and so on and so forth. So To talk about this, I invited a number of people who are experts in this area. Some people who understand people who are imprisoned as immigrants, people who are imprisoned as people who may have committed a crime, people who didn't commit a crime, but they are nonetheless imprisoned, right? Because not everybody in jail actually has committed a crime. As we know very well, many of them actually might be in death row even though they haven't done anything wrong. But someone in a group of people decided that they were going to go to jail and they were going to be dying in there. So I'm sure that by now everybody understands that I have a lot of feelings about people in jail and how this really irks me tremendously. And I will be infusing the conversation with some of the work that I have done in New York City for many years as a volunteer for the New York City, the Correctional Association in New York City, where I was a member of the Violence Against Women Committee, and we developed legislation, passed legislation 10 years later. So I will bring those things back to you guys. I will not introduce everyone that I invited because their names and their affiliation you can find in the chat box. And whenever I call on one of you, I will be asking you to introduce yourself by saying your name and your affiliation. So I know who you are. So when I call you, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. So a very quick introduction because we don't have a lot of time and we want to hear from you as much as we can, right? And I will have questions that I'll be asking you and I'll be moving from one person to the other and connecting the conversations that we have. One of the guests, Ashley Lucas, who is a professor in the University of Michigan. She's going to be joining us at 3:30 because she had another commitment. So that's the only person who that I have as a guest who will become later on. But she sent us Mary Heinen, who you can see somewhere in the middle here. If Mary, if you can just like wave at us so that people know who you are, who will be speaking around the same issues that Ashley will be speaking with us as well. So without further ado, I just want to ask you guys to listen for a moment. I was reading an article, and so here are some of the things that I got out of that, one of God knows how many thousands of articles that we have been exposed to. But this, it was about California, and it inspired me. So it says, some prisoners sick with coronavirus have complained that they aren't getting enough food and water while quarantined, and that they don't have access to doctors, temperature checks, basic medicine, phone calls, regular showers, outdoor time, or sanitary supplies. This is also true, of course, as we know, about refugees and immigrants across the globe, right? Inmates have reported being reprimanded for wearing face coverings. At least one inmate was formally disciplined for trying to use bleach to help clean a prison. In one facility, prisoners assigned to make masks for others allegedly contracted COVID-19 in the process. Some prisoners with COVID-19 have been unable to talk to loved ones who have been left uncertain if their relatives are still alive. And again, this is also true for immigrants and refugees across the globe. And many of those people that the article calls inmates have been working to help us, curb COVID-19 and making pitiful hourly salaries to do so, and is still putting them at risk. So having said those things to fill your heads about the questions that I'm going to be asking you, as we have been doing for several weeks now, I will ask everyone to join me in a moment of silence as we ponder and think about and wish well those who are sick and think about those that actually have perished. So please join me. Thank you, everyone, for joining me in this moment of silence as we start our discussion so that we can center on what's important here, which is the people that we are going to be talking about. So we talk about them as human beings, we talk about them with utter respect, and we accept comments and feelings from everyone, so long as those things as shared with respect to those who are participating and those who we are talking about. So I think I'm going to start my questions with Bill Lopez. You would like to be called Bill, or you want me to do William? Should I go with Bill?
Bill is just fine, yeah.
Okay, and I'm inviting Bill to be the first because he is someone that I invited specifically because of his knowledge about immigrants and refugees. And so I'm going to start with you because this will help us in a way that's more global, and then we'll come back to the local in some ways.
Sure.
So what I'd like to ask you is, how do you, from your perspective, when you think about COVID-19, what might be the most important things that that we should be thinking about, and perhaps things that we should be thinking about as they relate to people in prisons and jails within the United States, and those immigrants who might be in Greece or might be inside of the United States, basically experiencing very similar conditions. And I would ask you to start by talking about you, so who you are and your affiliation, and make absolutely certain to cite your book as you
Sure.
talk about your work, because we want to hear about that.
I should have a copy right here to hold up. Um, so thank you,
Somebody
Dr.
will.
Pinto. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here with all my social work colleagues, and thanks for providing this opportunity just for fellowship when it's challenging to be socially isolated. So I appreciate seeing all your faces and your names, and knowing you're on the other end to talk about something we all care about. My name is Dr. William Lopez. I go by Bill. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health, and I wrote a book, Separated: Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid. The focus is on a raid that happened in Washtenaw County in 2013, so about 8 miles from where you all are working, right? These are our neighbors. It couldn't be more local for us. And I want to answer Dr. Pinto's question by briefly telling you a story. This is not a person in the book, but someone else that I've spoken with. Her name is Maria Domingo Garcia. And last August, Maria got up to do what she did every morning. She put on a white apron, her gloves, and she put metal gloves on her hands, and she got her knife, and she started separating chickens in the poultry processing plant, right? And so she's been doing this for months. She did it all through her pregnancy. She took a break and she came back. And when she came back, when her baby was 4 months old, there was an immigration raid. And so this immigration raid was one of 7 coordinated raids across 6 sites in Mississippi, the largest coordinated set of raids in the US history. And Maria was one of 680 people taken. So she didn't know at the time that around then, but she was detained and would be deported in December. What she didn't know was that there was this virus that had just been detected that would later, as we know, there's the book. Hi, Betsy. Thank you. I appreciate that. What Maria didn't know is that this virus would come to the US and would sweep through all of the places that Maria had been. So Maria was in the poultry plant and she was removed. And right after that, in Mississippi and throughout the country, poultry plants would be devastated by these infections and deaths. Then Maria was detained. And what Maria didn't know when she was detained in Jenna, Louisiana, was that the next place COVID would infect is prisons and detention centers. And Maria was deported before that in December, and she finally arrived in her country of birth, Mexico, planning to reunite with her children in Guatemala. But she couldn't because of flight restrictions, which do not allow her to fly to a different country, right? So she still hasn't seen her children since August 7th of last year, and including her child who was nursing, right? And the reason I share this story with you is because I think it's very illustrative of how many different opportunities COVID has had to impact one of our society's more vulnerable members, a woman of color, a woman who's undocumented, a woman whose first language is Spanish, and how it missed her by a few months every single time until she landed in Mexico, but then impacted her life in a way that didn't involve getting sick. it impacted her life in a way that involved a policy change, which was she could now no longer fly to Guatemala to be with her family, right? And this is illustrative both of the of many points, one of them being the way this shifts is not only people who are getting infected, but also the policies that change the lives of the people who are healthy in these communities. And I know this is a long answer to the one question, but I want to set this up so I can build on it so we can all discuss it later. When Maria was in the meat processing plant, poultry processing plant, which is a part of a larger system of meat processing and food processing, infection rates in food processing plants are at about 50%. Let me say this in a different way. Let me rephrase this because I want to. Detention center infection rates are at about 50%. I have that backwards. Detention is about 50%. Prisons are about 60 to 70%, right? So this is every other person. Now in the meatpacking plant that Maria worked in, if you look at the cases of COVID, I was gonna say explosions. It's not the way they're referred to, clusters of cases, right? Of over 100. That means over 100 cases in one site. Of the top 30, 2/3 of those are prisons and jails. 1/4 of those are meatpacking plants. And then there was, I believe, the Battleship and the Princess Diamond, right? So with the exception of where these things perhaps started, all of the clusters are places in which in our country, we house people of color, right? And the reason that these are such infectious places is precisely because we as a country are so good at doing what we're doing, and that's incarcerating people and feeding our addiction to meat. The reason we can do that so efficiently is because we house brown and black bodies very close together in factories and in prisons, and then limit their access to the things that keep them safe in infectious situations like hygiene, supplies, and certainly space, right? So I'll end just by emphasizing that in an environment where washing your hands and keeping social distance is what you do to prevent a spread of disease, the environments in which we've clustered people of color end up being ideal circumstances for the spread of this disease. Thank you, Dr.
And I just want to, throw it at you, and then I'm going to be moving to other people as well, because a couple of things, were striking. One is how the people who actually try to help those who are under those circumstances also end up being affected by COVID-19, right? Be it a health provider, be it an attorney, be it a volunteer, they end up being affected in different ways when they try to help as well. So if someone would like to pick on that topic later on, so that's one thing. The other one is how the idea of housing people very closely together, which we have done historically long before COVID-19, right? So I'm gonna leave Bill for a moment, and I'm going to be moving to Warren back in Newark, New Jersey. You have to introduce yourself again. Warren was here, before as a guest. And to ask you the connection between those two things, right? I mean, there are millions of immigrants on the East Coast and millions of people who were born in the United States in jail with a preponderance, like Bill said, of people of color, particularly Black and Latinx people. So this conceptual idea of housing people, close together as a way to achieve certain things that we usually don't talk about. And in this particular case, Bill very wisely said the addiction to meat. Here's the vegetarian saying this, so I don't mean to offend anybody who eats meat, but there is conceptually an addiction that comes with the hormones that are used in the meat and many of the ways, animals are fed, etc., right? But also the idea of bringing people together in many ways just to simply curb their capacity to advocate for themselves and change their lives. So Warren, what are your thoughts about that? And you can, say your thoughts about anything you want, of course. You have to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, great.
All
Thank
right,
you.
guys. So, Rogerio, thank you. My name is Warren Thompson, and as Rogerio said, I was a guest at one of the previous meetings where we just discussed kind of how COVID has impacted the city of Newark, New Jersey. And one of the areas that I have spent a significant amount of my professional career has been working with those that are either currently incarcerated or have been released and could be on some sort of community supervision. New Jersey said that they were going to pass this early release act, and that they were going to look at individuals that they deemed as not really a threat to public safety, and they were going to allow these people to be released early from incarceration because they knew very early on that the things that Bill and Rogerio have described, you know, the living in very close quarters, you know, the poor quality of food, the poor quality of medical care. You know, if we're bleeding on the outside, they're hemorrhaging on the inside. So taking all of that into consideration, apparently the last numbers I saw, and I apologize for having to give you an approximate on this, but about 3,500 people were identified for early release. Only 100 or so have been released. So having worked in that Department of Corrections world for a number of years, they're probably, there's such a far end of the spectrum away from a conversation like the people on this call would be concerned about, right? So everything with their mindset is just safety and security. You broke a law, whether it was an immigration law, whether it was just a law of the land, whatever it is, there's a law that's been broken, and there's a certain amount of security that has to be put around you because you can't be trusted to be out in society without breaking laws. And that's the mindset. So when you start talking about human rights and things that just a human being should have, a lot of times that gets lost in their conversation because they're just so concerned about punishment. Right, everything is punitive. It's the whole mindset with corrections is you broke this rule and you need to be punished, and our job is to make sure that that occurs. Right.
And having them all locked in the same place makes it easier, right?
Absolutely. It's all about control, right? So if I'm able to have you in one area and you know, they'll lock the prisons down, they'll lock the jails down. They've stopped all kind of movement. So individuals that would be, let's say, in a county jail that would be eligible to move to the prison, they're not having that sort of movement going on. You know, so all kind of movement has really stopped with that unless it's been deemed like an essential medical concern. So all of those sort of things are really what's going on here. The inability for family members to know what's going on with their child or their loved one, right? They have very limited communication. They've stopped all visitation, right? So you can't go into the prison at all or a jail to see, or even these detention centers. We have, New Jersey has, in fact, Newark has immigration detention centers that are run by, you know, private prison companies. So all of those things that normally would be some sort of mechanism to keep the family at least aware and engaged with the individual that's incarcerated, that's been stopped during this pandemic. You look like you want to ask me a question, Rogerio. That's why.
No, you did. I just, you know, because my mind went in a few directions, and one of them is that many people have been trying to resolve those problems that have been exacerbated by COVID-19, because the reality is those things were there before, right? I just, because COVID really did not create a lot of the things that we see today, right? I mean, they didn't just surface, they were there, and they're being really underscored on a daily basis by by COVID-19. So what I would like to do now, I think that, Warren and Bill set up very nicely for us many of the complications about populations that have been confined to very specific spaces. What I would like to do is to move the conversation to what have people done to help those populations, and have we seen in the past many years any difference? And so I would like to ask all of my guests, and I'm going to start with Josh Ho to talk about how he has been thinking about in terms of policy that has come about because of COVID-19, and how different or how similar they are to policies that had already been there, and to what extent what's happening now is just using COVID to perpetrate even more punishment as to the way that Warren just described. So if you could connect those dots for us and introduce yourself first.
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh Ho. I'm a policy analyst at Safe and Just Michigan. I'm formerly incarcerated. I'm the host of the Decarceration Nation podcast. So I think it's important to start with a little bit of context. As of today, 59 incarcerated people and 2 staff members have died from COVID-19 in Michigan prisons. 3,262 incarcerated people and 336 staff members have tested positive for COVID-19 in Michigan's prisons. Over 2 months ago, many of the organizations across the state who pushed for reforms explained that this might happen, and we all shared a number of ways to address what we believed was likely to become a catastrophe, which kind of gets at the question you were asking. A very abbreviated form of our suggestions were: first, treat incarcerated people humanely. This is extremely important in prison because, especially when it comes to medical care, one of the biggest problems is that the medical care, when you have a serious disease or something in prison, tends to resemble punishment. And what I mean by that is you usually get put in segregation, or what's called SHU, or segregated housing, or solitary, however you want to look at it. And so for a lot of people, to admit that you're sick not only suggests that you're going to be punished, but it also means that there could be retaliation against you, because all of the people who you come into contact with could also be brought into contact with that punishment. And so one of the things that I think one of the reasons we have such huge numbers in Michigan is, I think, because of this fear of retaliation and this desire not to admit sickness. So it's very important that the way that the Michigan Department of Corrections dealt with the problem treated people humanely and gave them every opportunity to feel comfortable being sick. The second thing that we suggested is that they made sure that all prisons have the necessary cleaning supplies and protective equipment. That's happened at different levels so far in different places, but I would not say that we've been thoroughly thrilled with how that's all worked out to this point. We've also asked that people who are in prison should be able to communicate with their loved ones, and that they should be provided with the means to sanitize any communication equipment so that they don't risk getting the virus from, for instance, having a phone call with their loved ones. And we think it's very important that they have those phone calls.
And to what extent have those things come to fruition?
Well, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I would suggest not very much. Some of them have more than others. There has been some PPE, the cleaning equipment has gotten through. We haven't been able to get what we would like, which is free communication, like phone calls and stuff like that during this pandemic. The fourth thing is we want to make sure that everybody who can get out gets out. In other words, anyone who's parole eligible. Michigan is one of the only states in the United States that still has truth in sentencing, which means that everybody who has been sentenced has to serve 100% of their minimum sentence. So someone has to be parole eligible to be released. that the governor has moved to increase the days that the parole board works. So there has been an increase in paroles, but she has not expanded the parole board, which is one thing that we asked for, and she has not expanded her use of commutations, which is the last thing that we asked for. The reason why that's important is the vast majority of people who are at risk of dying in Michigan's prisons are at risk of dying because they're aged or because they have health problems. Those people tend to be people who are not parole eligible. They're people with long and indeterminate sentences. Recent research, oddly enough, from the University of Michigan suggests that people who are over 50 and have done 5 years in prison are under a 1% risk of recidivism. That evidence was presented by Sonia Starr and J.J. Prescott at the University of Michigan Law School. It came out just this month. So we think this is a very low risk population, but it's a population that people generally don't want to help. Governors don't want to help people who have violent charges, for instance, and they're the people most important to get out. And so what we've been really pushing for is for the governor to use her commutation powers to make more people eligible on a case-by-case basis, especially those who are at the most risk, so that they can get out. And we've had absolutely no luck at that. The few things that we've gotten, I will say, have been great, and where we continue to push for more.
Can I have just a quick, I want to ask you one quick question, and then I'm going to ask Mary Heinen and Ash Lucas, who just joined us, because I want to see if they can help us make distinctions between male prisoners and female prisoners. If the things we are talking about apply to the two genders, but I'm going to leave that for Ashley and Mary to talk about. But I want to ask you, because you gave like a very compelling understanding of very specific requests that, if they are all put into play, might be very helpful in the state of Michigan. And I don't know if the same things that are happening here, would you say that those requests and the way the governor is behaving, and of course, I mean, not only her, but like everybody around her, if this, the scenario that you just pictured for us, is this something that is happening across the country? Is it typical? Is it just happening in Michigan? Do you have any idea as to how what you just described compares to other states?
Yeah, I would say that there are some governors who have done more with commutations than others, but it's been the exception, not the rule. I would say in general, Michigan has actually been better than most states in terms of testing, but they've been about the same as most states in most of the other areas. They were a little bit, I will say this, the Michigan Department of Corrections has been much more transparent than a lot of the other states, and I keep in touch with evidence across the states. That doesn't mean that we don't have criticisms of the Department of Corrections, but every day they have been providing totals of testing, where testing has happened, who has died, et cetera, which is much more than a lot of states have done. I would say that overall, most of the states across the country are struggling with this issue, and it is, I think it's 4 of the top 7 places in the country in terms of infections are correctional facilities.
Well, the Correctional Association of New York it still has like a whole arm that is related to monitoring jails and prisons. And I always made the assumption that every state might have, some organization, monitoring those things. But I came to understand that even states that have those things do not put them to use in the same way. Thank you so much, Josh. I may go back to you, but I would like to go to Mary first and then to Ashley, to see if we could distinguish the conditions that we have been talking about between genders. And I say that because, and this is probably my, so this is someone who worked for many years as a volunteer for the Correctional Association in the committee, that looked into issues related to violence against women, which I was extremely concerned about, and I still am, about women in prison. But interesting enough, when I'm having a conversation such as the one we are having now, for some reason in my mind, I'm always thinking about males in prison. I don't know if anybody else has that, but it's like in my mind, even as a child, in my mind, only men were in jail until, I realized that that was not true. and there are, enormous difficulties for women in jail as well. So I was wondering if Mary and Ashley can speak about what it is that they do, because we are talking about ways in which we can help those who are imprisoned. So I'll start with Mary, and if you can just make a distinction in terms of gender whenever possible for us. But introduce yourself first, and then we'll go to Ashley.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Mary Heinen McPherson. I'm the project coordinator for PCAP at the Prison Creative Arts Project. I've been with PCAP 30 years. I was incarcerated at age 21 with a life sentence, and I came home when I was almost 50. And so the prison that had 158 women on August 5th of 1977, when we moved into Huron Valley, Women's Huron Valley now, the day that the old Detroit House of Corrections closed, now holds over 2,200 women, many of whom are very, very ill right now. It's a terrible problem that certainly crosses genders, but with women, I think the fact that they're being thrown into segregation if they test positive or if they're close to anyone that may have possibly infected them, they're being stripped of their property. They're being treated as if they were segregation, misconduct problem prisoners. They have very little support. They have very little communication with the outside world. And it's certainly, the pandemic is hitting the women extremely hard that have had histories of domestic violence and abuse, of which probably 80% or more that would speak to. What I'd like to say is there was a statement issued on May 13th from WHO, from the World Health Organization, and it says, "We, the leaders of global health, human rights, and developmental institutions, come together to urgently draw the attention of political leaders to the heightened vulnerability of prisoners and other people deprived of liberty to the COVID-19 pandemic, and urge them to take all appropriate public health measures in respect to vulnerable populations that is part of our communities." What I'm seeing and what I really need to put out there is, this is a very, very rare opportunity. I've never seen it any time in my life, to be able to educate the public about what happens when mass incarceration blows up in your face. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now. The conditions are so severe because there's so many prisoners. There's no way to possibly isolate anybody and give them proper treatment because there's just no physical space for it, with the exception of humane treatment. And so WHO is recommending reducing overcrowding, ensuring the health, safety, and human dignity of all persons, ensuring access to continued health services, respecting human rights, and adhering to the UN's rules and regulations. I think this is just a primo opportunity to educate the public about policy and best practices and what should happen and what could happen, instead of the what I'm seeing in the press is just over and over and over and over horror stories. I think we need to put policy out there, and the way that I've watched the governor hone the message on what she wants people to know about staying home, about proper hygiene, about her decisions. She zooms right in on those nuts and bolts of what she wants people to remember, and they remember it. And so I think it's important for us as advocates and policy folk and people that are directly affected, certainly that's me, to get the message across to everybody that we can speak to about best practices and best policy from the World Health Organization perspective, in particular, in this time of crisis.
Thank you so much, Mary. One thing that it really struck me when you were talking, I'm gonna go to Ashley, is many things, but it's like for a moment in that I said to myself, I mean, this is a moment where people who are complaining over and over again about having been inside of the house for a few weeks, like really, like sometimes in ways that are just so annoying to me, where it's like this enormous horrible thing that is happening in their lives. I mean, I think that this is a moment to actually focus on that and think about, and help them to think about if this was a permanent thing, or if it is something that you knew not necessarily permanent because you might have a chance to get out of jail or out of prison. But if this was a sentence for the rest of the next 10 years, this is the way it's going to be. I think it is a place where we can go to help people begin to understand what it means to really be incarcerated, and how easy it becomes to feel awful, right? Even though you can keep everything else around yourself, in a few precautions, but you still basically have your life to go and come and do whatever it is that you want to do. I think that that's a moment where a thing that we can use to help people begin to see the realities that Mary just, talked about. So let me go to Ashley and ask, so introduce yourself, please, and then just pick up on whatever Mary said and anything else that you'd like to say.
Thank you, Rogerio, for hosting this conversation. I'm honored to be here, and I'm sorry I arrived late. I was on another call until 3:30. My name is Ashley Lucas, and I am the former director of the Prison Creative Arts Project, which I led for the last 6 years, and now I am the co-primary investigator on a project called Documenting Criminalization and Confinement, which is a large-scale digital humanities archival project run by a group of faculty at the University of Michigan called the Carceral State Project. And we are trying to document what's happening not just to people in prisons, but also people in immigration detention, people who are over-policed, people who are under the thumb of systems like probation and parole, and what happens to people because of all of these carceral forces in our lives. So we've had a lot of data about how none of these systems are working properly for a very long time, but most of that data is not in the form of storytelling and the arts and giving a human face to all of this. So that's what our project is really working on right now. And to speak to what Rogerio was just talking about in terms of using this moment to learn about what incarceration feels like for those of us who have not lived in prisons, I'm working with a team of formerly incarcerated folks and University of Michigan students this summer to create some short videos, a series that we're calling Living on LOP, What We Learned in Prison. And LOP, for those of you who haven't served time in Michigan at least, it stands for loss of privileges. And the folks who are going to be a part of this video series are giving short lessons that they learned in prison that might help us all navigate the pandemic lockdown situation right now. So we're hoping to be releasing those videos starting next week or the week after next. But that's one of the projects that we're working on at the moment. In terms of thinking about gender issues and how the current pandemic is affecting groups differently, Michigan is a state, like many in the US, that has just one women's prison. So Women's Huron Valley, which is in Ypsilanti, Michigan, is the most overcrowded prison in the state of Michigan. And for my money, it's the worst place to be within the Michigan Department of Corrections, because women who are particularly on high levels of security have little to no programming at all, whereas there are whole prisons for what we call level 4, which is basically the highest level of security before you end up in solitary confinement. And so men on level 4 get not as much programming as people on lower security levels, but they get a fair amount more programming and access to one another, access to things in general than the women do, because at Women's Huron Valley, there's no place for those women to go. So if you're on a more restricted security level, there's just a lot less space in the prison for you to navigate. And the programming that gets offered first to the people with lower security levels. And by the time you get up to the folks on level 4, and God forbid level 5, which is solitary confinement, you're not actually getting volunteer-based programming, people coming from the outside with educational or therapeutic or artistic programs at all. So the level 4s are cut off from society in much the same way that people on solitary confinement are. I had a letter just this week from a longtime participant from PCAP, the Prison Creative Arts Project, who is at Women's Huron Valley, and she has not tested positive for COVID, but the woman who works at the station next to hers did test positive. And so the prison's response was to put her in quarantine for 9 days, which is basically administrative segregation or solitary confinement. And they put her in the hole for 9 days with nothing but a few hygiene products. So she had nothing to read. She did not have the little MP3 player device that has her music on it or anything to help her pass the time. She was just staring at the walls for 9 days. And this is a woman who suffers from MS and chronic depression and other underlying health conditions, and had also suffered domestic violence. So you're sitting in a cell just staring at the wall for 9 days for nothing except the fact that the person next to you had tested positive for COVID. And everybody at Women's Huron Valley and at the men's prisons knows that this is what's going to happen to you if you have a positive test or you're near somebody who has a positive test. So people are faking not having symptoms. People are hiding the fact that they're ill because they don't want to be treated in the same ways they would be treated at the highest levels of punishment in prison. Basically, what we're saying is that sick people need to suffer more.
So this, this reinforces what Josh was telling us, not too long ago about people basically hiding, symptoms or I mean, I wouldn't even say it's hiding, just like, being smart about, not disclosing depending on the situation.
Yeah. And
go ahead,
just briefly to speak to a couple of other things that were being mentioned in the chat right before I started talking, the situation with transgender folks in prison is very complex. And in the state of Michigan, like many other states, trans people in prison are usually assigned to the kind of prison, to the gendered prison that matches the gender that was listed on their birth certificate, which means often that people are in the opposite prison of the identity that they would choose to inhabit. And particularly for trans women in men's prisons, this puts them at extraordinary risk of sexual assault from both staff and other incarcerated people. And so they often end up in administrative segregation. They often endure severe physical and psychological abuse. And having a pandemic complicates all of that as well. The other special set of circumstances that I wanted to mention in regards to gender is that at Women's Huron Valley, because it is the only women's prison in the state, girls who enter the system by federal mandate, all children under the age of 18 have to be separated by sight and sound from adults in prison. And in men's prisons in the state of Michigan, we have a whole wing at Thumb Correctional for the boys because we've locked up so many young men and so many boys who will graduate into the system and become young men living in prison. But for the girls, because there is no other women's prison and because the overcrowding at Women's Huron Valley is already so severe, the only place to put them is in solitary confinement. So that's really psychologically damaging for young people.
Well, which, what you're describing, I mean, has been reported over and over again in many papers that I have been reading, the emotional toll and the complications in terms of grief, depression, anxiety, people who were not necessarily or may have had like, low-level anxiety or having panic attacks. People who were depressed, a couple of days a week now are depressed, for much longer periods of time. Before I go to Baraka, which is the next person that I'm going to, I just want to thank you for bringing up the transgender issue. I mean, I placed it in there in the box. We try to talk about identities and vulnerabilities in every angle, in every direction that we can, because it is by addressing those intersectionalities that we can have this critical dialogue that we are having here for 11 weeks now. So I'm very glad that you did that. Baraka, I am not going to ask you to talk about gender, but you can if you'd like. But I would like to ask you to introduce yourself and to share with us your thoughts about the many issues that have come up. And if at all possible, just going back to what Ashley was saying and many others before, many of those issues relate not only to people who are in local prisons, but clearly in immigrant places where they're being held against their will, and in many places where immigrants are being held under very similar conditions. So I'm gonna pass it on to Baraka.
My name is Edward Sanders, and I go by the name of Baraka, and I'm a former juvenile lifer without parole. I spent 43 years in Michigan prisons. I served time at the Ionia Reformatory, Jackson State Prison, Marquette Branch Prison, Huron Valley Men's Facility, and Kinross Correctional Facility, URF, Brooks, Muskegon, throughout the system. I've entered into the system when there was only a few facilities, and then watched the system explode. As a former juvenile life or a prisoner, I'm working with various groups, particularly, and I should mention I'm a student at the University of Michigan School of Social Work. I came home in July 2017, and my practicum or field work is with the Detroit Justice Center, which is very much involved in taking and advocating on behalf of people who are vulnerable in this situation, as well as with the State Appellate Defender's Office, SADO in Detroit, which is also very much involved, and with Michigan Liberation Organization and other organizations that I volunteer with. I recognize that there individuals who are incarcerated, they don't have the autonomy to self-defense, to defend themselves. They are vulnerable. And as it's been said already, they depend on the government, the society, and their family, and goodwill, people of goodwill to take and advocate on their behalf. If we don't advocate on their behalf, then we leave them to other vices to take and try as best as they can to take and raise their voices. Prison here in Michigan, and I speak from 40+ years of experience, they're more apt to take and be untruthful with the public in regards to what's going on as opposed to the truth. They may have some areas of being transparent, but that's not necessarily their culture. Okay, that's not necessarily their culture, and they'll choose and pick what they want you to take and know. This is an institution that systematically take and try to disarm inmates to take and represent themselves in peaceful ways by taking and reducing them to pencils and papers, and take away all kind of computers or typewriters, things of that nature. They have went to court way before this incident to take and make sure the inmates had nothing in their hand but a pencil and piece of paper, because they're afraid of grievance and lawsuits. And so they go to great extents to take and destroy their properties. So to take and believe that after they do all of that, that they're being transparent or open is not true. Is not correct. And I would caution anyone from taking and accepting that, even if they appear to be. It has been said that the guys would take and hide their symptoms. Why I was incarcerated, I can think of a few of my own cellmates that died, they had pneumonia, and this was before this pandemic. Former juvenile lifers without parole, these are people who came in the system not as adults, but as children. And so they never developed the proper means of taking and defending themselves or taking care of themselves. I had one young man that used to lock with me. I believe he came in as early as 16. Well, he died in his 20s because he had pneumonia. I had an older gentleman that had been locked up since the 60s. He literally died just days after the U.S. Supreme Court decision. He was a survivor of cancer, but he still didn't know how to take care of himself, even though he was well into his 70s. He didn't know how to take care of himself. He was still smoking even after he came from the hospital, etc. So we have to be conscious of this. But I'm very elated to be in association and working with groups of people who have been taken and assisting vulnerable people in county jails. Like in the Detroit area, your county jails are empty. You hardly have anyone in the county jails because of organizations like the Detroit Justice Center, SADO, the Michigan Liberation Organization. They have been doing an excellent job. They have raised a significant amount of money. It could be more, where they could do more. And the attorneys have been working with them to reduce the bonds so that they can afford to take a bond out as many people as possible. They have cash bonds for as much as $2,500, and they have lower bonds, etc. So there is work being did, but the governor is the one that is not an actor. We have county jail administrators. We have even judges that are responsible for the kids at the Thumb Correctional Facility under the Heinen program. They are releasing those children. County jail sheriffs are releasing prisoners, but the governor is the one that is responsible for state prisoners, and she's not acting. She's numb to all of the calls for her to act. And as far as I'm concerned, she's on the same level as the federal government. We had in the federal system where the Attorney General made an announcement that so many prisoners will be released, and then literally after the news spread throughout the federal prison system, and the prisoners were notified and their families were notified, only to be told again later that you won't be released. So imagine that, the psychological effect to that. I receive telephone calls every day from prisoners in state prisons. Okay, one of the prisons that called me the most often is Coldwater Correctional Facility. The inmates there took and told me initially staff was separating the positive and the negative. And then they simply took and at some point began to take and return the positive back to the same housing units that they had originally came from and put them in the housing unit with the negative. And now it has exploded. If you look at that graph that they give you, as it was pointed out, that, you know, there's some transparency. They're showing you where the large numbers are, but they don't tell you how that happened. It happened because of their neglect. You know, they literally are taking and mixing the two together. It may be different at some other facilities, but that's exactly what I expect out of the MDOC. There is no uniform discipline. You can go to certain prisons and you'll find a certain degree of discipline, and you'll go to other prisons and you'll find a total lack of discipline among the correction workers. You'll find some staff coming in and creating their own policies. So just because the MDOC has a central policy doesn't mean that that policy is fairly observed throughout the MDOC. Don't expect it.
So what's been coming up for me by listening to you is that we started with the idea of, in many ways, the confinement, lack of space, and the idea of punishment as being central, as Warren, reminded us for prisons and jails, and Bill, the first person who spoke about how that also is present in immigration, holding cells, etc. But I think what Baraka did for us is to bring us from that perspective to something that I find very disturbing, which is cruelty, right? I mean, very quickly, we go from confinement, imprisonment, and then arriving at levels of pure cruelty in terms of the age of the people who are being put into those places, cruelty in terms of they get treated, as to what resources they may have, which I think in some ways makes it even more clear how much we need to have individuals from the outside helping to, like you said, Baraka, advocate for those who are inside and work, doing the best we can to do so. I'm gonna call on Larry Root, who has done some work in this area, to introduce himself and then share with us what are your thoughts and your feelings after you listen to to everyone today, and how are you in all of it?
Well, first of all, I think this has been a terrific discussion, and Rogerio, as usual, you've pulled together a great bunch of speakers, and they've covered all the things that I thought were important. The last thing, the thing that Baraka was saying, really suggests one area that hasn't really been addressed too much, and I'll just quickly mention it, and that's, almost like all politics are local, so much of corrections are local, and it comes about in two ways. So for example, we control our jail. In Washtenaw County, we've had a pretty good reduction in the size of the size of the population in Washtenaw County Jail. It went from a little over 400 people to a little under 200 now. And I think that's the role of our local criminal justice system, which in a lot of other ways needs reform and needs attention. The issues of mass incarceration, I've come to completely kind of focus on the role of the prosecutor in overcharging and the way things work. And we're facing an election this summer for a new prosecutor after having a person in the prosecutor's office for a couple of decades. And I think that one of the things you could do as an outsider and as a voter is really look at the role of the prosecutor. So we don't have so many people being detained in secure detention who don't need to be, and we don't have as many people charged. And that becomes very much of a local thing. And I think changing things locally, as Baraka suggested, can have a big impact, at least in our local area. So it's something that I think deserves a lot of attention in the next couple of months.
Thank you so much. A good reminder that it is, politics is local. And it also reminds me about what we can do personally, right? A few weeks ago, we talked about ways to volunteer. I remember Reverend Charles reminding us about, providing food to people in Detroit and how difficult it had been to find volunteers to go inside of places where the majority of the residents had been have tested, positive for COVID-19, and how difficult it is to actually get people to go inside of those places to provide the food that the residents need. So there are many things. So politics is local. What we can do is personal, right? I mean, the things we can do around us and the things that we can do that are not so close to home, but that will have an impact on all the policies and all the practices that many of us talked about today. One thing that I have learned in the past 11 weeks is that this 1 hour goes very fast, and that I leave those hours with so much to think about, because I have been able to find really intelligent, great people who come with their hearts and leave their personal stories for us to carry with us. And also leave with us enormous amount of knowledge that we can then share with our neighbors, our families, and our partners. So I want to thank each one of you for bringing an enormous amount of knowledge about this subject. And for those who shared your personal experiences, another thank you, because it really makes a difference when we can connect at a very personal level. And next week, we will come back. I hope many of you will be here. And next week, we are going to be talking about substance use and misuse. And of course, as we know, the enormous connection between substance use and the very topic that we talked about today, right? Which is, we know that, there is a preponderance of people who have been put in jail for God knows how long, sometimes decades, for using sometimes very, very small amounts of drugs. Nonetheless, they are confined and have to face the same enormous consequences that we talked about today for very little reason, and sometimes from a very young age. So in order not to be enraged by all the many things that we talked about today, I will take a walk. I encourage everyone to take a walk as a self-help and healing strategy, or anything else. I mean, it's very hard to have those conversations. And at the end, not having a place to take it. So I have found, very healing ways to do so. And I hope that you will as well. Again, thank you so very much. And I hope to see you next week. I'm Rogerio Pinto, professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Michigan, and I'll leave all of you with a big hug. Bye.
Bye.